Welcome to EB5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shaw, and other attorneys at Mona Shaw & Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB5 Investment Voice.
You know, Mark, Rebecca, it's been 2.5 years since Henrik Nesheim has last been on our show. Can you believe that?
It's been a minute. It's been a while. Episode 122 was a long time ago.
And a lot has happened since then. We were in the middle of COVID. We talked about global programs happening at that time. And in 2.5 years, so much has changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, a lot has changed.
Christian, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we have so much to get started with you. First of all, Europe, what is going on with all of these programs? Ireland is closing. Portugal is closing. What's happening?
Yeah, I think it's part of a broader market trend in Europe. As we know, the European Union is quite antagonizing, I would say. They're antagonizing golden visa programs, citizenship by investment programs. They've been doing this for a long time. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine provided an additional pretext for them to attack these programs, which are perfectly legitimate and are very beneficial to the local economies of these European countries. But these programs are demonized in Europe. It's part of the European philosophical leftist tradition of basically taking a very suspicious stance toward anything that's got to do with wealth and privilege and advantage. I think key politicians have a gut-based dislike for the fact that people who have money can buy residencies and citizenship.
We had seen a similar kind of attitude over here in the US. We heard congressional people say, oh, you can't buy citizenship, your US citizenship isn't for sale. And let's be very fair here, Christian. And Rebecca, you can certainly chime in here. America is a little different from some of these other programs because our program here is based all about job creation, whereas the European programs are about buying real estate and buying your way into the country, whether it be the UK, whether it be Spain, Portugal, Cyprus, Turkey.
Yeah, you're right, Mona. And Christian, I know you can speak on this more, but the US, it's more about how are we benefiting the economy, much more than just buying real estate. And is buying real estate just, are they're buying it and coming into the country? Is it just sitting there? Is this something that you think, like with Portugal and Ireland closing, is this something they're working on?
Okay, so let's start with Portugal. So what happened on February 16th is that the government had made a press conference. They held a press conference in which they presented their new housing program. It's called, which means more housing in Portuguese. And Portugal does have a housing crisis. Housing is not affordable here for the average Portuguese. Let's say the differential between income and housing prices is much greater in Portugal than it is in the United States, certainly, and probably also most of Europe. And so the government needs to be seen as doing something about that problem. Now, the golden visa holders, which is a small group that has no lobby or representation as such in Portuguese politics, they've sort of become the scapegoat for that. And I say scapegoat, I use that word deliberately because they cannot possibly be to blame for the lack of affordability.
Let me ask you a question, because when the Portuguese program first started or really took off between 2016 and 2018-19, especially when the Chinese came in real force, at that point, we were dealing with crashed property. We're dealing with property which had been undervalued. And it was, as far as I could see, it was helping the economy. Isn't that correct?
Yes, of course, the golden visa was helping the economy. It was bringing between 600 million and a billion every year, depending on what year you're looking at in investment. So it was helping the economy, but I wouldn't say that it can't take the credit for helping the property market to recover, because as a proportion of the overall housing market, golden visas are really not, the magnitude of it isn't enough. Just to give you some tangible numbers on that, we know that last year, 168,000 homes were sold in Portugal, and fewer than 1,000 of those were related to the Golden Visa program. So it's just not enough to make a big difference. And that's why Golden Visa holders can't be to blame for the lack of affordability. I would say that the lack of affordability here is the problem is on the supply side. There are very few new homes being built relative to the number of homes being sold in Portugal. And I would like to point out also that having rich foreigners being interested in investing in your country is really a good thing. And if you have a lot of foreigners wanting to invest in your country, and if there's an indication they may be driving up property prices, then the answer isn't to try to stop the demand, but to increase the supply. So an easier solution would be to, for example, do what you do in EB5, where you focus on job creation, or you could simply say that Portuguese Golden Visa real estate investors must invest in new build properties, right? And that way, nobody could conceivably say that Golden Visa speculators are driving up housing prices. The real cause for the lack of affordability is the lack of supply, which has to do with things like the length of time it takes to get a building permit. And especially here in Europe, antiquated city centers, it's hard to get building permits for a lot of things.
So, Christian, is that due to COVID? We've seen that here, lack of building permits because of COVID, or has that been an issue in Portugal for some time?
No, my understanding is that even today, Portugal is building fewer homes than they did in the period before the 2009-2010 sovereign debt crisis in Europe. So I think it's something that's a chronic issue in Portugal, and it predates the pandemic.
You know, Christian, one of the articles that I read on your newspaper, and I have to say that Rebecca and I see very few good articles out there in online newspapers or any kind of forums. The articles that really give you accurate details. So, you know, hats off to you there.
Thank you so much.
One of the articles we read, and it's been all over the US press too, is the sudden popularity of the Portuguese program amongst Americans. That was a real surprise.
Yeah, that's a trend that we've seen coming for, I would say, since 2019, but it really took flight after the onset of the pandemic. And it's something that observation is not limited to Portugal. It's also observed in Greece, in Ireland to some extent, and a lot in Latin American programs.
Which brings us over to Ireland. What is your take on why the Irish program will be closing?
That's a little bit more difficult to say because they didn't actually provide much of a context. They didn't say exactly why they were closing it. There was some vague explanation about how the program had become China dominated, which is true. You know, 9 out of 10 investors in that program were Chinese. But in that program, certainly nobody was accusing the Chinese of driving up home prices in Ireland. It's typically not tied to residential real estate. Residential private real estate isn't really one of the routes to qualification for that program in any case. And so I part of it was they had seen an extreme surge in applications. Applications actually quadrupled in 2022 compared to the year before, mostly Chinese. And I think they got nervous somehow. I also think probably the European Union has been leaning on them. And of course, for the Irish economy, which is very dynamic, a Golden Visa program for them, they can take it or leave it, I think.
We've seen a trend. Rebecca, do you remember when we did that study when the Canadian program closed? And the trend basically, Christian, has been that where there's a lot of foreign investors who are coming in and they're purchasing properties and those properties are ending up being empty, there's a problem. And the second thing is with the Canadian program, they were using money which there was no inflow of capital. It was money which was they were using from Canadian banks, and they were not paying taxes. So there was just generally not a lot of extra capital generated from the program. So then the program ended up closing. And I'm wondering if these same factors are prevalent in Ireland and perhaps to a certain extent in Portugal.
Well, you mentioned the Canada, and let's think about the Quebec immigrant investor program. It's true as you say that was the investors were buying bonds, so essentially they were just providing additional liquidity to the government. Rates were extremely low as well, so there wasn't much net gain economically for the state through that program. Although that could change now, right? With much higher interest rates. Now, all of a sudden, selling bonds becomes a more interesting proposition. And we are hearing rumors that program may be reopening. In Ireland, I would argue that it was making a big difference. They were building retirement homes and they were providing huge endowments for research for universities. So this was much more tangible. It was tangible, it was job creation, it was investment in sectors that the government had already deemed in need of foreign direct investment. So for the life of me, I can't see why it makes sense to close the Irish program.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part. It's the after effect, right, of the investments. Like we said, it was kind of stagnant in the other programs where, yeah, you're just investing, but it's just sitting there, or it's money within the country. Whereas like the US program, like are people coming in to spend, right? A lot of people move to the US or their kids are moving to the US. So they're spending at the universities, you're spending to buy property. So there's an effect to the investment. And I think that's what we should be looking at with these programs. What difference are they making?
I would also say,
Mhm.
Rebecca, that comparing EB5 to
Mhm.
European golden visas is kind of an apples to oranges comparison, not just because the investment is about job creation in so explicitly about job creation in the United States, but also because it requires your presence and people who invest in
Mhm.
EB5 do plan to relocate to the United States. Whereas for the EU golden visas, that's one of the main selling points is you get the right to be there, but not the obligation to spend time there. So different type of program.
If you want to directly compare, we could compare to the UK program, because I remember when Priti Patel, the equivalent of Secretary of State at that point, suddenly made the announcement at the start of the war that they were closing the entrepreneurial visas completely, or the tier one visa. A lot of people said it was political, but you could say the same thing. There really wasn't too much money coming in.
Yeah, well, okay, so for that program, she announced it 2 days before the invasion.
There was a fear that it was Russians coming in, rushing into the UK, and then they couldn't really stop them once the application went through. So I thought it was political personally.
Yeah, these things tend to be political rather than practical, I think. And certainly that's the case in Portugal.
Yeah, but Ireland, Rebecca, you have an insight?
I think Christian's right. They didn't give much more to than what he's saying.
It was so sudden. It was so sudden.
Yeah.
We were at an event.
I was just going to say we were just at an event in January, like 2 months ago, and we're talking about the program. And yeah, and then it's all of a sudden it's shutting down.
Well,
Uh,
let me just say here that yes, it was sudden. The announcement was sudden, but the rumors about this potentially happening had been circulating for the better part of the preceding year. And that's what caused the 400% increase in applications in 2022. So they had never announced anything publicly, but people were kind of so the service providers, the different funds, etc., they were warning people, look, we're hearing in the halls of power that this may be the last year of the Irish IIP. And so that drove a massive surge in applications. And then they did finally announce it, and they closed. But yeah, they didn't provide any tangible justification as far as I could tell.
Yeah, so similar to the Portuguese program, from what I read on IMI Daily, there are questions on there like, can I still apply? Is there still time to apply? So I heard that the law technically hasn't been voted in as yet to actually stop the program, but it's getting to that period. So is there still time for people to apply for that program? What's going on in that area?
Okay, so what's happening in Portugal is that you had the initial announcement on February 16th. It provided very little detail. In fact, it was just kind of mentioned almost in a by sentence. And there's a public discussion period that's currently ongoing that was supposed to end on the 16th of March. Then it was extended, the government extended it to give additional time for input from the various stakeholders. They mentioned specifically that they wanted to accommodate and give extra time to get input from the municipalities. And so that period is now extended to the 24th of March. And then 6 days after that, the Council of Ministers will meet to make a final draft of the proposed law. And of course, it's important to point out that the law includes many more things than golden visas. It's a law on housing reform, which has golden visa, the closing of the golden visa program as part of it. There is some contention. There's a great deal of contention actually about the law, and there's been a lot of different voices, stakeholders submitting their counter proposals, and there's been a lot of articles in the Portuguese press from various stakeholders. But in any case, on the 30th, they will have this final draft. They'll then submit that to the parliament, and government has an absolute majority in parliament. So what can happen in parliament? So presumably parliament will ratify it, and then it goes to the president of the republic for ratification. And he can either ratify it right away, or he can send it back to the parliament and ask for amendments, or he can ratify it, but say that he wants the constitutional court to look it over. And many people have pointed out that there are lots of potentially unconstitutional points in this law. For example, the government in its proposal is saying they want no new visa applications to be valid from February 16th, which is to say, so February 16th is the day they announced it. And normally you would say, well, from the day of the publication of the new law, there will be no new applications. That would be the norm. But they're saying is, no, we'll go back to the day of the announcement. So retroactively, let's say this new housing reform becomes law sometime in April or May. What the government is proposing is that all the applications that were submitted between February 16th and the actual publication of the new law, all of those applications should also be invalidated. And that's a problem because right now, obviously, lots of all the service providers are urging people to get off the fence and submit their applications before it becomes law. But if it becomes law, according to the government proposal, then all of those applications will be null and void, right? And so I imagine that the various service providers and the sellers of investments are, having to guarantee
refunds,
right?
Yeah. So, Christian, moving away from Europe for a second, Turkey, that's another area where we've seen a lot of change in the last couple of years. So we're touching very quickly, a lot of the popularity between the Caribbean and Turkey for the US had been the fact that people could come have the ability rather to file for what's called an E2 visa, which is a special treaty visa for anybody who's not aware. And now there's been a law changed in the US stopping all of that. But we're still not seeing a slowdown in citizenship going into Turkey, even though they raised their prices from 250,000 all the way to 450,000.
A few months ago, Congress passed the Amigos Act, in which was embedded a new regulation on whether to grant E2 visas. Well, what it says is that they won't grant E2 visas to those who became citizens of a treaty country.
Yeah, if you have to be domiciled for 3 years.
So you have to be domiciled for 3 years. And if you got it on the basis of a financial investment, then you must have been domiciled for at least 3 years. So that brings up two interesting questions for you lawyers, which is how domiciled defined. Both the United States and Grenada are common law jurisdictions essentially, and common law jurisdictions have a rather particular way of defining domicile. So there's some trepidation tied to how will this be interpreted. And the second thing is, how do you interpret financial investment? is a donation an investment? And if we're going to say a donation is an investment, then maybe we need to redefine the term investment as well. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but yes, it certainly hasn't slowed down interest yet in, not as far as we can tell from the statistics in Grenada, which are published quarterly. We can't tell yet that there's been any significant slowdown. Of course, if there had been, that decrease might have been masked by the corresponding massive uptick in Russian applications to Grenada, because Grenada for the better part of 2022, it was the only Caribbean CIP jurisdiction that remained open to Russian and Belarusian applicants.
So that's good to hear, Christian, that you said you didn't really hear any large decrease in applications to Grenada based on E2. But now let's turn back to Turkey. As Mona said before, the amount increased. So, and we've still seen the popularity there. But as elections are coming up and things are changing again, what do you see with the Turkey program?
So the Turkish CIP is a bit of a black box in terms of statistics. They don't regularly publish statistics. What they do is every once in a while, there will be some ad hoc tweet from the Ministry of Interior giving you a total figure by which sometimes you're able to triangulate roughly how many applications they're approving each month, which is, when we've done it in the past, we've seen in Turkey that there have been periods where they've approved 1,300 applications a month. There's no parallel in CBI history really for that. It's an extremely popular program. But again, because we don't have statistics on it, I can't tell you exactly what's happened to application volume before or after. But what I can tell you anecdotally is that after the price increase, what people told me that there was an initial dip, but then the war came in between Russia and Ukraine, and now people are saying, look, every third citizenship for Turkey that I sell is now to a Russian. And this is actually reflected. We can see this in the statistics that Turkey does publish about residential investment from foreigners. So we can use that as a proxy to kind of see that, yes, there's a lot of Russians buying CBI in Turkey. So I think that some of the demand decrease resulting from the price going from 250 to 450 for real estate has been offset by a simultaneous massive uptick in interest from Russians, many of whom don't want to be Russians anymore.
Yeah. Are you seeing Russians, or are you seeing from other countries around Russia, like Georgia, Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan?
So principally Russians themselves are getting Turkish citizenship. Again, we don't have precise figures. This is just anecdotally from the service providers that I speak to in Turkey, but a massive, massive uptick in Russians physically relocating to Turkey. Turkey has often played that role in history, many times in history, throughout the Cold War, throughout the World War I, World War II. It's kind of been Istanbul has been a place to be for people from both sides of conflicts.
Yes, it is a bit of a hub in that respect, and that center point between the East and the West. An interesting place. There's another interesting place that you were discussing just earlier, Rebecca.
Yes, Panama. In the last year, I keep hearing about Panama, the CIB program there. How popular has that become, Christian?
So Panama is very interesting because for the last 10 years, they've operated something like 15 different residence by investment programs. Normally a country will have one visa category for investors, but in Panama they have a plethora of them, and they're all for different types of investment. So I think it's just a question of, for example, the Portugal Golden Visa has, I think it's 8 different investment options, but you get the same visa, but you have 8 different ways of getting it. Whereas in Panama, every time they come up with a new type of investment vehicle, they make a new visa category. So they have a lot of them.
Wow.
Yeah. And what I can tell you, I'm just looking at the statistics that we publish now that we get from Migración Panama. And what's happened is that the independent means visas, they don't require any investment. They just require that you demonstrate either a certain amount of assets or income. These are really setting records. They set records in 2022. They were more than double in 2022 compared to 2021, but also way above the pre-pandemic level. So there's a lot of people, especially Americans, relocating to Panama. Some of them are pensioners, some of them are remote workers, digital nomads, etc. But I think The broader picture here, and I'm sure you've discussed it previously on this podcast, is the mega trend here is that people now work from anywhere, and when they learn that they're location independent in terms of income, which they learned, many of them, during the pandemic, they are now saying, look, why do I want to pay 15 grand a month for a studio on Manhattan when I can live in a mansion on a beach in Panama for the same amount of money?
I ask myself that every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, it really depends on what you do because, for example, with what we do, Christian, we work in investment visas. We do see a lot of clients who come and make an effort to come and visit us because they're putting a lot of money into a program. They're putting trust and faith, and they want to come and see, are we real? Do we have an office? Are we? Are there people who work here?
Certainly, no question that there are still many jobs that you can't really do effectively remotely. But what I'm saying is that the pandemic was a watershed moment in that it allowed a lot of people who didn't know that they didn't know that they could work remotely. They discovered that they actually could. And those people now, this is why we're seeing pre and post. One of the big differences pre and post pandemic is that prior to the pandemic, all the people who were applying to EU golden visas, for example, they were doing so with the aim of having that residence permit in their back pocket and maybe one day use it. But now what we're seeing increasingly is that people are actually willing to physically relocate. And that also means that they don't necessarily need to invest in the golden visa programs and make investments, because take it from the point of view of the government. If they want to monetize their country and their visas, they can say either, look, you don't have to come here, but you have to make an investment or a donation, and then we'll give you the document. Or they say, look, if you do come here and become a taxpayer here and consumer here, then you don't have to invest, presuming you are, just show us that you're someone whose consumption and tax payments would make a difference to us, right? So more people are in that latter category now, where they are willing to up sticks and relocate.
Yeah, you know what I also find very interesting, and this is something which I thought the COVID brought out. Pre-COVID, there was a trend in the US for investment in the main cities, whether it's New York, California, DC. Post-COVID, or even I would say afterwards, there is a movement outside of the big cities to the smaller cities, the places which are not so well known. And I'm feeling that same is happening with the CBI program. Instead of everybody focusing on the US, Canada, and the UK, there is that movement towards other countries, smaller countries, less well-known places.
Yeah, and often countries that have lower cost of living, better weather, this type of thing, right? So we're seeing a massive, yes, lower taxes is a big one. This is why we're seeing a very sharp increase in interest for Latin American programs. Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, which Latin American programs?
We already mentioned Panama, but there's also Costa Rica is a big one. Nicaragua is a big one. Farther south, you have Paraguay, Uruguay. They're also very popular. Colombia has an interesting investor visa. In fact, almost all the Latin American countries have either an investor visa or independent means visas. And frankly, the primary applicant demographic are Americans who want to pay lower taxes and have more sunlight hours and enjoy, a higher standard of living on the same income.
Well, one thing is for sure, we're not going to see the demise of the CBI program anytime soon.
No, I don't think so. In fact, I think we'll have more of them. What's been holding back the development of CBI or the proliferation of CBI programs is that people in the past, the holy grail was Schengen access, right?
Yeah.
So you can get into Europe, but I think that's changing a little bit because the European Union has been sort of dangling EU access. They've been telling, for example, Albania, Montenegro was not forced, but they were essentially enticed to close their program because they want to get into the EU, and the EU is saying it would be a pity if something happened to that EU candidate status of yours. Maybe you should close that CBI program that you have. And so I think that if you take Schengen and the EU out of the equation, there are lots and lots of countries out there that will find it very interesting to run and operate CBI programs. I know some people are suggesting, for example, Vanuatu, which just lost its Schengen access, that they're saying what they should do in Vanuatu is they should basically cut the price by 40-50% and focus on the market that doesn't care about Schengen and just sell citizenship in Vanuatu for, 75 grand.
Oh, gosh.
And target more of the sort of the mid-market for the people who are not necessarily so concerned with Schengen. Because what you could do is if you just want a second citizenship, let's say you could buy it for 75 grand. Now it's 130 grand in Vanuatu, but that's the price that was there before they lost Schengen. So either they get back Schengen or they have to cut their price.
So, Christian, there's just so much more to discuss. I would love to have you back on. Mona and myself would love to have you back on to further discuss all these other CBI programs, especially Paraguay. You're mentioning all these other South American programs. So, Mona, here's to another 7 years for our podcast program, and that we will be discussing not more than EB5, but all these other programs that are out there. And Christian, again, I'm going to reiterate what Mona said is we do enjoy reading your IMI Daily. And we really look forward to seeing you and meeting the rest of, everyone in the industry at the IMI Connect in Malta in May.
Yeah, that's going to be a great time. I'm really looking forward to that as well. I'm very glad you're coming.
Yes, we're excited.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Christian, for coming on and enlightening our audience again. And let's have you back before there's another 2.5 years, perhaps.
Anytime you want. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for being with us today on EB5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shaw and Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's mshawlaw.com. Make sure you don't miss our next episode focusing on a different aspect of the EB5 program by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB5 Investment Voice.